Welcome to The Explainer. We're jumping right into a massive ecological mystery today, right in the heart of Africa. We're going to look at Lake Victoria, which honestly is one of the ultimate case studies for modern human environmental impact. It's this wild story of incredible biodiversity, human ambition, and a literal chain reaction that completely rewired an entire environment. So, think about this for a second. How does a single introduced fish completely change the fate of Africa's largest lake? Just imagine this massive inland sea, right? Teeming with this intricate, perfectly balanced web of life. And then, one single predator gets dropped in and flips the whole ecosystem upside down. How does that even happen? Well, to figure that out, we kind of have to rewind and look at what this place used to be. Section 1, a lake brimming with life. Take a look at Lake Victoria here. It's actually the second largest freshwater lake in the whole world. It's massive, and it's shared by 3 countries. Tanzania has about 49% of it, Uganda 45%, and Kenya's got the remaining 6%. For centuries, this giant body of water has been an absolute lifeline for the communities living around it, providing food, water, transport, the whole shebang.
But beneath the surface, that's where things get really wild. It was a sheer explosion of life. Lake Victoria was home to this mind-blowing number, 500 different species of haplochromine cichlid fish. 500! And what's just crazy to scientists is that this biological diversity evolved in a rapid adaptive radiation over just the last 15,000 years. In evolutionary terms, 15,000 years is literally the blink of an eye.
And here is the absolute kicker. Over 99% of those cichlids were endemic, meaning they lived in this lake and literally nowhere else on Earth. They weren't just swimming around aimlessly either. You can think of them as the highly specialized, super hardworking janitors at the lake. Roughly 80% of them fed on detritus and algae. They formed this incredibly tight internal recycling system that kept the waters crystal clear and perfectly healthy. Section 2. The dominoes start to fall. So where did it all go wrong? Well, the pressure really started with a massive population boom. Look at this. In Uganda alone, the human population went on a completely exponential ride between 1921 and 1991. We're talking a jump from 2.8 million to almost 16.8 million people. That kind of explosion right around the lake's basin, it put an unprecedented, enormous demand on the lake's resources, especially the fish, since they were the absolute cheapest and most important source of protein around. To feed all those new mouths, fishing tech had to level up, and fast. People used to just fish for subsistence, using simple basket traps or papyrus nets. But then, in 1905, these highly efficient flax gill nets hit the scene. Catch rates shot through the roof, and then totally crashed. By 1931, authorities actually had to impose minimum mesh limits just to curb the overfishing. But, people still needed to eat. So in the 50s, synthetic nets and outboard motors arrived. The pressure just hit a boiling point. Fast forward to the 1970s, and fishermen were using smaller and smaller mesh nets, sometimes down to just 5 millimeters, desperately trying to catch anything at all, completely wiping out juvenile fish in the process. Way back in 1927, a guy named Michael Graham did the first real systematic fisheries survey of the lake. He noted that the native zinjay, also known as the Singida tilapia, was the most important food fish. It was absolutely beloved by the locals. He literally said no other fish equaled it in quality. But tragically, because everybody wanted it, and it lived conveniently close to the shores and markets, it was one of the very first native species to just get severely depleted by this initial wave of overfishing. Section 3, enter the Nile perch. All right, so the 1950s roll around, and officials decide to bring in a heavy hitter to fix this fishing crisis, the Nile perch. And this right here is where we see the ultimate shift from a diverse native species ecosystem to an introduced predator population. It's a night and day contrast. On one side, you've got the native haplochromines, tiny, peaceful, algae-eating janitors. On the other side, the introduced Nile perch, massive, aggressively predatory, and, crucially, commercially very valuable. The grand ideal was that this big perch would eat the tiny, commercially unappealing cichlids and basically turn them into large, profitable fillets. And, well, they did exactly that, but with absolutely devastating efficiency. 200. Take a second to let that number sink in. 200 native cichlid species are feared to have gone completely extinct just because of this one introduced predator. Once the Nile perch population exploded in the late 70s and 80s, they just systematically hunted the native cichlids. In fact, scientists call this the most dramatic example of human-caused extinctions within a vertebrate ecosystem ever. Section 4. An ecosystem out of balance. So when those native janitor fish vanished, the lake literally got sick. It began to suffer from something called eutrophication, which is basically a super rapid nutrient enrichment of the water. Without millions of tiny cichlids swimming around eating the detritus and algae, all that organic matter just sat there, acting like fertilizer for these massive toxic algae blooms. It basically triggered a total biological cascade. Check out how this works. Step 1. The Nile perch wipe out the native janitor fish. Step 2. Because those janitors are gone, unconsumed detritus just sinks to the bottom and decays. Step 3. That decaying matter mixed with a bunch of agricultural runoff and sewage from the growing human population fuels these giant, toxic, blue-green algae blooms. And finally, step 4, when all that algae dies and decomposes, it essentially sucks all the oxygen right out of the water column. So the deeper parts of the lake literally became dead zones. Nothing could survive down there. And you can literally see the difference. The visual transformation of the lake has been wild. Today, water clarity has dropped to 4 times lower than it was back in the 1960s. So what used to be this incredibly clear, pristine ecosystem is now, unfortunately, often just a murky, algae-filled green soup. The lake's internal biological recycling machine is just straight up broken. Section 5. Weeds and green waters. Then came the next invader, the water hyacinth. Fueled by all those excess nutrients we were just talking about, this invasive weed showed up in the late 1980s, and it is nasty. It forms these incredibly dense floating mats that cover whole bays. They block out the sunlight, they stop the wind from naturally oxygenating the water, and they literally trap fishing boats and completely stall out large ferries. And worse still, these stagnant mats are basically 5-star resorts for disease-carrying mosquitoes and snails. Meanwhile, down below the surface, the fishing industry had to figure out how to adapt to this completely degraded environment. With a large native fish gone, and honestly even the Nile perch struggling in that oxygen-depleted water, the fishermen pivoted. They turned to the silver cyprinid. Locals call it daga or omena. The whole industry underwent this massive shift towards catching this tiny, super resilient, and fast-reproducing native sardine. Today, it's these tiny fish that provide the primary source of animal protein for the surrounding communities, and they have to catch them using incredibly fine mesh nets. Section 6. The future of the lake. Now, here is a totally surprising fact for you. Unlike a lot of other Great Lakes that rely on huge river systems feeding into them, Lake Victoria gets a staggering 80% of its water right from direct rain falling onto its surface. Just rain. That makes this lake uniquely and pretty dangerously vulnerable to whatever is happening in the sky above. And naturally, that brings us to climate change. Because the lake is so reliant on rain, extreme weather events like El Niño cause these massive, sudden fluctuations in the water levels. Back in 2006, severe droughts dropped the lake to a 40-year low. But then recently, we've seen unprecedented rainfall cause historically high water levels, displacing hundreds of thousands of people and flooding critical sanitation infrastructure. Add in the warming temperatures making the lake's water column more thermally stable, which stops deep mixing, and those low oxygen dead zones we talked about, they just keep getting worse. So we've seen how the introduction of one single fish, combined, of course, with a booming population and pollution, triggered this unstoppable domino effect that reshaped an entire region. As a primary case study for modern human environmental impact, it really forces us to ask a tough question. If human actions can completely unravel an ecosystem of this magnitude, this quickly, do we actually have the power, the knowledge, and the will to put it all back together? It's a massive challenge, but it's one that the 45 million people living around Lake Victoria have to face every single day. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. I really hope it gave you a whole new perspective on the awesome responsibility we have to our environment.